Greetings and welcome to the 2020 Reform Party National Convention. This is our public forum, presidential Q&A sessions we have with each of our four candidates that are seeking the Reform Party nomination for President of the United States. We'll be having a session each night, tonight, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday with our different candidates. Tonight, Ben Zion. Tomorrow night, Rocky De La Fuente. Thursday, we're going to be talking with Soraya Foss, and Friday, Max Abramson. Tonight, I have the very distinct pleasure to welcome Ben Zion. Ben is from Phoenix, Arizona, and he is a organizer within the techno-futurist movement, which looks at a lot of different and exciting things regarding futurism and technology and how that can benefit our lives. And so we're very fortunate to have Ben with us tonight. A couple of housekeeping items before we kick things off. We are accepting chat throughout the course of this Facebook Live presentation. So please submit your questions as we go through. We've already received quite a few questions earlier over the course of this week. We also are recording this event, so this will be made available on our website on reformparty.org. As well as on our Facebook page. And then later we'll also post it to our YouTube channel, and we'll make sure that people have that information. So we have a lot of topics to get to, so I'm not going to go into a lot more formalities. I'd like to ask you, Ben, to take about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes to introduce yourself, tell us who you are and why you want to be president.
Yes, thank you, Michael. You mentioned that I'm an organizer amongst techno-futurists, and in fact, the platform that I've described in our last meeting, and I'll take a moment to describe throughout this talk, the Reform New Deal was born out of discussions with prominent techno-futurists and thinkers in this area, and I'd like to say a little bit about myself as a human being as well. In 1930, there had just been a horrible Great Depression had begun, and there was a gentleman running for president in the years to follow, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, if you had asked anyone at that time, times prior, would have described him as a rather socially and fiscally conservative individual. But he came to occupy a space because of the necessaries of the times. And I would argue that we are in a similar crisis today. We have as many as 40 million Americans out of work due to a plague outbreak. We have cascading effects of a troubling kind, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about all of this. People are looking at the United States and worrying what comes next. And I have said to many of the delegates, and I will say it again now in full view of the public, I am a fiscally conservative-minded person, but I think that we have to take this moment in history to also not only talk about these things that concern us, perhaps the things that we don't want, but also be very clear with the public about the things that we can offer them. And that is why I am proposing a Reform New Deal based on this previous writing that I mentioned, which includes a middle-class freedom dividend based on a federal land dividend. As you're probably aware, there are about 25% of the total area of the continental United States is held by the federal government, and 85% of those lands are not national parks, and we can lease those to carbon neutral companies that keep to a specific aesthetic, and because those lands themselves are valued at approximately $170 trillion, we can generate $1,000 a week for every adult, and this would be something if the Reform Party were able to accomplish this incredible piece of legislation, we would be the ruling party for 100 years to follow, I believe. This is people need something like this now, and we have to do whatever we can to try and give it to them. And so I am a basic income advocate. I am also a fiscal conservative, And I offer to you all that we can do both of those things in the form of the Reform New Deal. I'll talk about the other pillars of the Reform New Deal at greater length, but I think I would just also say it's a pleasure to meet you all.
No, and thank you very much, Ben. Appreciate that. It's a great introduction. The first topic that we're going to get into tonight, and the first set of questions that have come to me, have to do with the current situation of violence against Black Americans. We have a lot of social unrest, a lot of social inequality in this country. And as we've seen, a lot of the violence from police to Black Americans has caused a lot of disruption and anger within the African American community, but also across the country. What would you do as president to try and help resolve a lot of these kinds of issues and try to create a different tone, as well as create some progress into resolving some of these challenges?
Yes. Well, ethno-nationalism has been described as a powerful drug, and but I would tend to think that these kinds of concerns, we don't face this kind of situation in a country that already had a middle class freedom dividend. We don't face this kind of trouble in a country that already has my third of the Reform New Deal platforms, a public health service that uses emerging technology in a more powerful way, the quote unquote Medicare for All Plus program. If people did not have this healthcare insecurity and this high degree of income insecurity in these troubling times, we wouldn't have events which I would regard more as catalysts. I'm highly sympathetic to the Black Lives Matter movement and to these incidents, George Floyd and a number of others since and before. But we must also consider that these do reflect public policy failings in the United States, and not simply the fractious dealings with communities. Those things go hand in hand, and in order to prevent these kinds of situations from escalating out of control, we do have to, I believe, focus on economic policy and domestic policy initiatives, and that is my feeling. That being said, I would encourage people to continue to attend these protests and events in a peaceful manner, but they have already put a good deal of pressure on the larger civil society and on our government to begin to adapt the kinds of policies that you and I are discussing here tonight, Michael. And so I would regard this, much of this is a net positive, and I do feel that we should stand with a peaceful and productive protest culture.
Great. What about, though, there's been a lot of talk about defunding police departments, and I think there's been some anger from conservative and far-right groups saying that defunding law enforcement is only going to increase crime, while more progressive groups say that we need a more progressive alternative to law enforcement as well as to social services in different communities. What's your position on the defund police movement, as well as the concepts and things that have been brought forward by Black Lives Matter and by other progressive groups?
You know, it's interesting. In recent days, I've noticed that the ostensible leader of a protest movement in recent years, Bernie Sanders, has diverged from some of the folks who are calling for this defunding of the police. And but it brings into a sharp focus these essential problems. We shouldn't have these dangerous chokehold and these because this does reflect a very specific set of training that people are receiving that is quite barbaric. But we also if we are to truly reform the police, we do need to have peace officers, community police who are interacting with their constituents in a reasonable way. And unfortunately, over the course of the last 20 years, there's been a militarization of those forces and cultural shifts in those forces that have contributed significantly to us moving in the direction of unrest. This is unrest, and it's upsetting. I would say of the defunding the police notion, I think it's a little bit of a wrong sort of word to use, but I do feel that there's an awful lot of other kinds of services that could be provided in that are aligned with that spirit of community policing. And when people say to me defunding the police, those are the kinds of services and approaches that I think of.
Great. Along those lines, we were talking about a lot of the issues relating to Black Americans, as well as to other minorities, people of color, people who are transgender. I think one of the challenges that we've seen is with the two-party system, it really becomes a battle of us versus them, two sides kind of fighting against each other. And for lack of a better way of saying it, really what ends up happening is nothing gets done because the two sides almost kind of battle each other to a stalemate. What do you think you would be able to do to help try to bridge that stalemate and try to bring people together in a way to actually make progress on issues such as important issues relating to violence against Black Americans, but again, across the divide of a lot of other issues as well?
Yes. Well, you know, I was heartened by these internal discussions of recent days on a somewhat related matter to do with the use of a ranked choice voting system in our Reform Party process. Because it is very true what you've said. This two-party system, it's turned the United States into a company town. And these matters of electoral reform, of which ranked choice voting would be one of many, as you're all no doubt aware, would go a long way to fighting against that. Princeton University sociologists a few years ago, they conducted a study where they sadly determined that the United States is not a fully functioning democracy anymore. There's outside watchdog agencies that point to a similar set of concerns, and I don't think it's unkind to point these things out because this is a failing of this two-party system and this voter suppression and other kind of electoral inefficiencies. These are very real, and we need to fight against that. That is why the third of the elements, the three pillars of the Reform New Deal, is I Vote USA, which is a blockchain voting system, very, very closely modeled on that of Estonia, which has the highest functioning blockchain voting system and I-voting system in the world. They, in fact, have achieved such great things in e-governance that they are now beginning to do another thing which I rather admire, which is using this digitalization of governments in their public health service to address these inefficiencies and better use of emerging technology that I alluded to in my opening remark. But this is a very safe and cost-effective and also, most importantly, I think, you know, there's a two-factor authentication system that makes it very difficult to manipulate this system at scale. One individual could be manipulated, but no significant number could be manipulated, and that's in stark contrast to the way that voting machines are manipulated by the two-party system today. The Diebold Company does still exist. They changed the name, they rebranded, but there's still these sort of things are still going on, and that doesn't go on in the blockchain. That is because there's a transparency that's necessary in that infrastructure, and also because there's a user participation and these other features, security features occurring in the light of day in real time. All of this would allow us to make great strides in electoral reform. So I would encourage you to consider I Vote USA, the blockchain voting proposal of the Reform New Deal for America.
Great. I want to bring it back to a little bit more back to what's going on. And did get a question that came in from a delegate in Florida. The person writes, hello, Ben. Thank you for your ongoing service to our country. Can you elaborate more on your stance on qualified immunity? Do you feel government agents should be able to violate citizen rights? How do you stand on voting rights for felons? And where do you stand on prison population and prisoner abuse? And why don't we take them one at a time? And we'll start off with your stance on qualified immunity and government agents and civil rights for Americans.
Yes, yes, these are important questions, and I should say questions that the Reform Party has always had very clear and good solutions to, and that is indeed admirable. This is I think it does call back our earlier questions of the causes of civil unrest in the United States, because these abuses are very real, and we do need to find ways to better address those. And my feeling is that our best approach to dealing with the problems of a police state is to I know that there's a lot of folks in the independent political community who are resistant to these notions. I grew up as a sports a kind of sportsman, firing guns at an early age. But I do feel that the focus on gun ownership does create a situation where the police unions and these similar entities have a very handy canard to point to reasons why they cannot de-escalate. And so it leaves us all in an unusual kind of bind. And I do feel that at the center of this really is seeing that these militarized police move in the direction of being a community police. And this is not an astoundingly new set of ideas. The rest of the developed world is able to have community police that don't have 1,000+ deaths on their hands a year with relative ease. And so we need to just follow these other handy diagrams by these other agencies, and that does also involve breaking the strength of some of these entities. I am quite pro-union in most instances, but I do think that a police union is an example of an organization that does need to be challenged on many of these points.
Great. One of the comments along as you were talking that came in through the chat and through the Q&A from one of our delegates in Texas says that Boston's experience with community policing is that it doesn't work for all. Is there another option? And I think that kind of gets to maybe the heart of the issue, is that sometimes people are looking for that one silver bullet, that one solution, change this, switch to that. What is your position as far as diversifying options, and what other options do you maybe see that exist other than community policing or sort of standard police work?
Yes. Well, I'm reminded of the events that have led us to this so-called CHAZ, this autonomous zone in Seattle. And it's not wholly dissimilar from the events that led to escalation just a few years ago in Missouri. That set of escalations was owing to a kind of over-policing and a kind of economic predation on the part of the police that is working poor people, and unfortunately, particularly people of color. But it definitely was a hard socioeconomic skew overall. Were being ticketed constantly. People who couldn't afford to pay those tickets, and that led to that led to a situation where there was again a solidified protest movement, and that could have been easily avoided by not having a police who are providing a very dubious value in taking working poor people's money over and over again. There's a lot of elements of policing where there is some kind of poor tax in effect, and this is something that it's also something that the techno-futurist thinkers in other areas are very good at of describing some things in discussions of, for example, full automation. There's no a discussion of greater automation without discussing something like what has happened in various European countries, and increasingly so a public transit that is both fully automated and also in those urban environments specifically does not collect fees from users. And this is something that we should all aspire to, I believe, in the 21st century. Just as I think that we should not look askance at a basic income as some kind of special treatment. We should try to accelerate in all things within reason, and improve these institutions, streamline them, make them more technologically sophisticated, and make them not things that are onerous to the general public. That is how we avoid situations of the kind that occurred a few years ago, of the kind that are occurring on a much larger scale today. We have to really consider how this impacts ordinary people and do our best to see that we do right by them.
Great. Let's dive back just to make sure that we cover the questions that the delegate from Florida asked, in particular felon rights, as far as felon voting rights. As you know, there are a lot of states. Florida is one, Virginia is another, in which felons need to actually apply to get their rights, voting rights, restored. In other cases, people such as Bernie Sanders, who you mentioned before, believe that voting rights shouldn't actually be taken away from people who are incarcerated. So what's your position as far as protecting voting rights for Americans who are incarcerated, or Americans who are released? Because this certainly has become an issue in a lot of cases where governments tend to kind of slow walk that process of restoring voting rights, or make it very difficult for people. Do you support keeping voting rights for when people are in prison, or do you support a faster process for restoring voting rights for when people are released? What would be your position?
Well, and reflecting on that that initiative to restore voting rights to Floridians who had been in prison, I'm reminded of a couple of details there. There was a Supreme Court ruling, a Supreme Court fight that followed that described how some details of this, as implemented by Governor DeSantis and company, looked an awful lot like a poll tax itself. And there were any number of other stratagems where, after this popular initiative was advanced, there seemed to be other kind of voter suppression fingers insinuating their way into that initiative. And that's unfortunate. That's something that's been occurring in the United States over the last 4 decades, and that is why I feel that we do need to stand firmly on the side of this voter enfranchisement that you've described. We must see that people have the ability to vote. And I'll say again that this digitalization set of initiatives that I've described, I Vote USA and blockchain voting, would allow for an awful lot more access of these previously just disenfranchised people, a lot more simplicity in those things as well. As to the question of felons in prison being allowed to vote, that is it's not something that I haven't considered. I'll say that I am in favor of that as well. But this I would really tend to focus on broader and more technologically based electoral reforms. Sometimes there is a tendency to focus on wedge issues in this country. You might be surprised to hear that, and that is why I do appreciate this Reform Party focus away from particularly polarizing social issues, because we have to find strategies that will be solving problems and speak to people and not play into this two-party system that is very, very adept at focusing on a relatively limited number of issues that are quite polarizing.
Sure. Great. We do have a lot of issues to still get to, and we're about a half hour in, so I want to make sure that we try to get through some of these. As you talked about a little bit earlier, the pandemic, the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic that obviously hit the United States. There's been a lot of analysis and look back at sort of what's happened and what the response of the government has been. A lot of people see tremendous breakdowns across the government, from aging technology that hasn't been able to process unemployment benefits, to even the IRS systems, which we're still at over 30 million people out of a country of a little over 350 million people still haven't received their stimulus checks. Many millions who filed in January, February, March, and April still haven't gotten refunds on their taxes. And then, of course, there's a lot of other systematic breakdowns all across, not just technology, but even just the process that the government has gone through, getting people tested, screenings, all those kinds of things. What do you see as sort of the top three principal failures that, it doesn't have to be exactly three, but what do you see as sort of the top failures from government? And what would you do differently to make sure that if the next pandemic comes along, when you're elected and you have to take office, what are some of the steps that you would take to make sure that Americans are safe and that their government functions at a higher and better level?
Yes, and these are indeed the questions of our time. And it's a travesty what's occurred in recent months. We could have easily weathered this from an epidemiological response approach alone much better. Even just reducing the response time of the federal government by 1 week could have saved these 80,000 of these 120,000 deaths, if not more. Even an earlier response time could have prevented much of the impact of this. The United States is a very wealthy country, and although some of this infrastructure has been undermined or left to go to seed, there's no reason that we shouldn't be among those countries that are able to avoid this. We also have a relative geographic isolation, closing airports, for example, at the time when we knew this was coming would have made sense, but there was not the political will to do so among the general population or the leadership. But of the more pressing matters here, because I do think there are more pressing matters here relating to this public health concern. If you look at Germany or most of the rest of the developed world, they are not on the brink of having the state of Washington join Canada or something like this. They are not on the brink of the absolute breakdown of the civil society right now. They have their citizens collecting unemployment insurance, relying on their public health service, and preparing to go back to doing the good work that they were doing prior to this outbreak. And we are not in that situation, and that is because we have not allowed those kinds of institutions to flourish and to be funded. I am fundamentally a techno-libertarian, and I am fundamentally an economic conservative. But we have a great number of people in this country who we've never given them the position to keep the wolf from the door. We've never really put them in the position to be living well. And as a result of these institutional failings on the part of all of us and on the part of our legislators, we are now in a position where the wealthiest country in the world is potentially facing more serious strife, if not something not unlike a total collapse, because we have not and something like that unemployment insurance, something like freedom dividend, the federal land dividend, something like a public health service that serves all segments of the population, that allows people to not only weather the storm in these bad times, but in better times to be building small businesses, to be taking care of their families, to be doing all the things that social conservatives want us to be doing, but we are always scratching our heads as to why those things aren't happening, and that is down to a failure of the essential organizing of economic policy.
Yeah, that's a great segue. I do want to talk about economic policy. A couple of questions that have come in, and we've talked a little bit before our live session about this topic, as far as the president sort of made famous the concept of draining the swamp. And what we saw, unfortunately, is that the swamp in DC is certainly very much still alive and very bad, unfortunately, for most Americans. So there's a lot of problems with political corruption with this president, but we see this from both parties, and we see an incredible force between the two parties to really stop the other from being successful at every turn, even if it benefits the American people in the long run. So the question is how would you be able to, quote unquote, drain the swamp when the bureaucrats and lobbyists will basically oppose you with every tool that they have at their disposal, and really try to prevent changes from being made? What are some ways in which you could potentially make a difference to try to bridge that gap and start to make progress?
Yes. Well, I will once again refer very briefly to my digitalization of government, I Vote USA, which would do a lot to address some of this electoral dysfunction. But the problem of draining the swamp is a more particular problem, and one that has come into sharper focus in recent decades. That is why I would repeal Citizens United, and I would change these also work in service to removing this dark money phenomenon. There's a lot of this moneyed special interest control of our government is dictated to us by forces that we cannot very well see or track, and this is why this problem has gone from one of a moderate scale in the late 20th century to one of an egregious kind that we see today. And so we have to insist upon this kind of transparency. Just as I mentioned that a digitalization of government initiative of a blockchain variety would create an awful lot more transparency, we have to insist upon this kind of transparency and this kind of interactivity on the part of citizens, and a responsiveness on the part of legislators to those citizens' concerns. Right now, the kinds of economic policies that I mentioned, 80% of folks, independents, Republicans, Democrats, are in favor of these kinds of things. But what about the legislators? They're ignoring these cries and continuing with their toadying behavior in service to these moneyed special interests. And this has got to end. If we don't find ways to be more consistent with the political will of the people, we are going to see that our government is going to become something not very valuable, and that our country is going to become something increasingly unmanageable.
Sure. Let's shift gears briefly before we get back into economics. Let's talk about education. Um, as we know, education policy over the last several decades, there have been a lot of different initiatives, from No Child Left Behind to you name it. And the issues, of course, with a lot of states is that they've either maintained or cut education funding. But now with COVID-19, there's an incredibly new challenge in that they have to try to manage space and education, deal with a lot of educational regression from kids being out of school. And we're kind of at a crossroads almost with education policy. A lot of the things that have been done over the last 30 or 40 years have not produced any kind of results. What would an education reformer or a techno-futurist do to really kind of change the direction of our education system, which, while public, is really sort of focused on the factory model, right? It's sort of the idea of mass producing a bunch of standardized little people, much like the old early factories of the 19th and the early 20th century. So what would a techno-futurist do to kind of change that model, change education so that children of all economic backgrounds, all races, and all diversity have a better chance at a better future?
Hmm. Well, this is an interesting subject. As a techno-futurist, I can speak to a number of particular strategies that I would like to see pursued in the near term that would allow us to take a rather different tack. And when I began to formulate this Reform New Deal, we were not at the point where young people were being kept out of school. We were not at the point, the kind that you described, where we were forced to confront some of these changes coming more quickly. And now we are, and I think that it's timely to say this. One thing I would like to say is that we should define what education is in a little bit broader sense. I believe that access to data is something tantamount to a natural right, something that should be regarded as effectively a civil right, and this is why in my Reform New Deal for America writings, I include encouragement of a transnational compact between developed nations and others in support of Elon Musk's Starlink project, to hasten that project so that we can have extremely low cost or government funded, effectively free data that could be streamed around the world to all. And now, why do I say this in the context of education? As I mentioned, I have mentioned that I am a techno-libertarian and a fiscal conservative, but I also believe that we have not fully realized our civil society well enough to stand on fiscal conservative talking points alone. And I mentioned this in the context of the federal land dividend, but I will mention it now in another context, which is that of providing unschooling and homeschooling options, and providing the co-occurring services that would allow people to more effectively do that, namely childcare provided at the federal level, and things of this kind. If you have a basic income where people are able to spend time with their families and start small businesses, if you have data as a right, and if you have childcare provided, you do not need these very costly institutions in the form of public education institutions. And I think that we can easily meet the standards of these institutions and still pursue these other models. But that requires that some effectively, and I know that this is, of course, administered at the local and state level, but that it requires that effectively some of those resources be put into these other kinds of programs. Most specifically, this child care program, these other programs, the Starlink type program would not be terribly costly. And of course, the federal land dividend is quite costly, but it's funded through a novel means that I've described, the leasing of these lands.
Great. Now, as you know, Democrats, Senator Elizabeth Warren, probably one of the more popular Democrats to advocate for this, supports fully public paid college education. I believe maybe just at the junior college or community college level. But there's a lot of movement among progressive groups in particular to have more funding for college so that students don't need to pay in order to get a higher education. But of course, one of the challenges we've seen is that education has changed so much that college and the first few years of college almost become extensions of high school, just paid extensions of high school, in which you're not really gaining as much knowledge. But so I guess the question for you is do you support fully paid 4-year or 2-year college education, or do you think that there's a better way as far as funding education benefits or opportunities for young people?
Well, my response to this, I should maybe offer a caveat that there is a lot of area for private and public-private partnerships in this realm. But I do feel that this is pretty uncontroversial in most other parts of the developed world. This disincentivization of pursuing advanced education that occurs in North America because of the great cost associated with tertiary education, it is most unfortunate. And it is contributing to brain drain type effects and the stymieing of ourselves as leaders in many disciplines. And this is something that we should address. And so yes, I would also tend to support a greater focus on the existing public institutions. And this is a little bit like it might not seem so closely connected, but it's a little bit like the free public transit analogy that I referred to earlier. When you reduce the paywalls and reduce the personnel required to enforce the paywalls in those public transit systems, the cost actually goes down substantively enough to make it worthwhile to make those services free. And this is demonstrated in public institutions as well. There are still costs, but a lot of the costs do derive from these administration, the administering of scholarships and various programs. All of these layers of bureaucracy that would be removed if you simply make those public institutions effectively free of charge. And that is something that I feel we as Americans have a tendency to want to make some value judgments and say there's no such thing as getting something for free, and in doing so, we're ignoring ways in which we could be streamlining and better serving our citizens.
Excellent. Let's shift gears to a different topic. So let's talk about healthcare. As you know, that much of the debate that's been sort of popularized recently by Senator Sanders over the last few years has been for a Medicare for All plan. Senator Warren has her Medicare for All plan. Others believe in having a public option as something that's available, but keeping our private system intact. And Republicans favor abolishing or reforming the Obamacare system or the American Affordable Care Act, and putting in more economic measures and more free market systems to try to encourage growth and development. Where would you stand as far as reforming healthcare? What solutions and ideas, and if you can come up with just a couple of examples of things that you think would be better than maybe what we've heard to date from some of the other two-party candidates?
Well, I am shocked that we stand at this moment in history and we do not have a president who would say, I will sign a provisional emergency executive order to reduce the Medicare age to 0. We have 40 million people who are out of work. Many of those have lost their employee-provided health insurance. They have no means to support themselves, and because of this plague conditions, they are at greater risk, and many of them are quite ill. And the fact that we do not have a president, I'm quite convinced that almost any other president in this moment in history would have already signed that emergency executive order, aside from the considerations that I mentioned where any other president might have tended to avoid this situation entirely. But This is something where that is reducing broadening the Medicare program is a different approach from the one that I mentioned of a public health service that focuses on greater digitalization and automation. But I do feel that what they have in common and is the universal providing of healthcare in this country, and that is something that people the people's support for this notion has nearly doubled. It's gone into the stratosphere. Again, more than 3/4 of people are in support of this across the United States now. And so in the first 100 days of a Ben Zion administration, I would sign that emergency executive order if this pandemic were still ongoing. And but I would also continue to allow for the creation of these public health services that would be ultimately would be great cost savers. We have to sometimes we do have to set aside some of our own peccadillos and see that we are at an unusual place in history, and we have to act in a way that is responsive to the needs of people at this time.
Sure. Let's change topics again. Let's shift away from domestic issues and talk about foreign policy, which hasn't gotten quite as much attention recently, but is certainly something that is very important to not just Americans, but indeed with America's leadership in the world, something that's really important. So one of the first and arguably kind of one of the most important topics is our relationship with China and the current situation in China. The president has done a lot of work, and the Vice President Biden, has supported close relationships with China. This president has obviously gotten into a lot of trade battles with China. What do you see our relationship with China being in the years ahead, and what would be your approach to dealing with China, particularly since they have rapidly expanded militarily and been more aggressive in the Pacific? And they've also had a lot of human rights abuses, particularly a lot of problems increasing in Hong Kong. And we see a lot of tension also on the border with India as well. So how would you approach China, and what would be sort of your main priorities as far as dealing with China in the future?
Yes. Well, the current president has done something unprecedented and foolish in engaging in this trade war with China, and that has created what has been described as a hybrid war set of conditions between the U.S. and China. And there's no looking at the situations that we are in now in this era of cyber wars and influence operations, and not seeing that there is some connection there. And I think in the fullness of time and the longer lens of history, we will be able to better track those interrelationships. But suffice to say that this hybrid war that is escalating and very involving cyber wars and trade war responses have led us to this very, very confusing time, or certainly have contributed palpably to that confusion. And this is, again, another situation where the decisions of one person who is not considering the implications of what they're doing has hurt all of us, and that is indeed an upsetting situation. As to China policy, I'm inclined to say that we should. There's not all of Trump's foreign policy impulses, I think, are absolutely wrong-headed. He has resisted the impulse to take us into war, despite having advisors who would be described as dominionists or warmongers. But that is high-ranking officials throughout. So some of this is a situation that is reasonably palatable. But the missteps that have led to the larger problems that we now face are simply unacceptable. We do have to accept, however, that the United States people don't. Social conservatives in the 90s and other folks were fond of referring to American exceptionalism. Since this tendency to the middle class collapse that's occurred in recent decades, people don't point to this idea of American exceptionalism quite so much. And this is also, unfortunately, a reality on the world stage as well. We do have to take somewhat more of an isolationist stance on some of these matters, and mostly, of course, reduce the obscenity that is spending on the military-industrial complex. This is tens and tens of $1 trillion over the course of the 20th century and early 21st century that have been poured down the drain on Pentagon bloat. And that is one of the great crimes of public policy in the United States history. And that tens and tens of trillions of dollars represents a loss of resources that could have been spent on social programs and other kinds of initiatives that would have stabilized us instead of forcing us to these series of crises. So my answer to what should be the relationship between the U.S. and China would be it should be a stable one, but it should also be one wherein we recognize that we live on another continent far away, and we go about our own business with sound domestic policies and reduce our vast expenditure on these foreign policy matters.
What about, though, we've seen China become much more aggressive in the Pacific, really threatening our allies in Japan, our allies in the Philippines, as well as our allies in South Korea, building different military bases and facilities. Over the last few years, the United States has made investments, as you talked about, investing in defense, specifically shifting a lot of its resources towards the Navy and towards military work within the Pacific. Would you support those continued efforts in an effort to try to counterbalance the growing Chinese threat, or do you believe in a more neutral posture is better in the long run?
Yes. Well, we can't simply cease to be a superpower overnight. And so by and large, the considerations that I mentioned a moment ago are budgetary concerns, and those are concerns that have to be phased in, these kinds of considerations. We do, for better or worse, we have come to this point where we are this superpower that does bear the brunt of a lot of the expense of much of this, dare I say, world policing. And the Japanese, the South Koreans, particularly, and many others would probably be quite surprised if we were to remove some of these initiatives. However, Japan, they have a pretty good set of approaches to diplomacy with China. South Korea and these other powers in the region are able to negotiate these waters. I think of the way that Australia in recent years has shifted from being more under the U.S. sphere of influence to more under the Chinese sphere of influence, and that has not caused some unsettling of the Pacific as a result. So we have to first and foremost behave sensibly, but also consider that we are a country of 360 million people in another part of the world, and we have a duty to those 360 million people first and foremost, and that might involve stepping back at times from some of these matters in a phased and reasonable way.
Great. Let's keep it within the region, but let's shift our focus to North Korea. As we recall, there was a lot of talk about the president's overtures to Kim Jong-un, going to North Korea, visiting with him in an effort to try to stabilize the situation and nuclear tests as well as rocket launches and other things. But recently, North Korea has shown a much more aggressive posture towards South Korea. They've abandoned a lot of the peace talks. What do you think? It doesn't seem as if there's really much that can be done to negotiate with North Korea. How would you approach Kim Jong-un? Would you look at it as this is just somebody who needs to be contained, or do you think that there's an opportunity to more successfully negotiate with North Korea to create a more stable and balanced relationship going forward?
Yes. I certainly think that there is a lot of room to negotiate there. And I remember, although not so clearly, I was quite young, but certainly in reading after, I remember the fear mongering that was taking place when people were talking about the reunification of East and West Germany. But in practice, this was a relatively simple matter, not a simple matter, but one that did occur to the benefit of the citizens involved. And I do feel that North and South Korea could be at this point already if the United States had a little bit more willingness to do what I've said before, which is to reduce our expenditures on these foreign bases and this what I think is overall wrong-headed approach to foreign affairs. We don't need to have 6,000 bases all around the world. The fact that we do is not contributing palpably to geopolitical stability, particularly as the United States' role in recent years on the world stage has shifted and diminished. Some of that credibility is lost. Unfortunate, but all the more reason to consider diminishing that role. Yeah, sorry.
No, I was going to say along those lines, shifting gears a little bit to Russia and to NATO and our relationship with Europe, because you talked about sort of our investment in military as well as our presence in military bases all over the world. One of the conversations that's being had now is whether or not we need a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We've seen NATO used for all kinds of things, for military operations in Libya and in the Middle East, which is really not what NATO was originally designed for. It was designed as a counterbalance to the Warsaw Pact and the potential of Soviet aggression in Europe. Do we see, or do you see, rather, Russia as a threat to invade Europe? Do you believe that the U.S. needs to maintain a military presence in Europe to counterbalance Russia? Or do you think that we should be looking at bringing our troops home from Europe and looking at a different kind of structure for what currently exists as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization?
Well, I'm inclined to think that Russia is a little bit of a paper tiger in some of these respects militarily. Of course, they have devoted much of their intelligence resources to cyber wars at great and intrigues of this kind with a pretty significant payoff. But in terms of the aggressions that they have engaged in recent years against former Soviet bloc countries and regions, and this unsettling tendency to continue to do so, I don't know that it threatens the European Union to such a high degree. For example, a thing that rather threatens the European Union right now, the Brexit, was something that was tended to be spearheaded by people in North America to a higher degree, or as high a degree as people in Russia. The aggression, I would view, to some degree, I view this notion that Russia is an aggressive force a little bit the way I would tend to view North Korea. These are very unsettling things, but maybe they're given more lines above the fold than necessary in some of these instances. Yes.
I was going to say, so would you consider then our focus maybe better to, and I'm just basing it off of what I'm hearing you say, do you think our focus would be better spent on defending from cyber attacks? Because currently, really the top countries that are engaging in cyber attacks are sort of the usual suspects, right? China, North Korea,
Absolutely.
Iran, Russia. May be surprised, but Brazil is actually up there in the top 5 list as well, or in the top 10 at least. So do you think that particularly with the wave of technology that we see, and the impact that these cyber attacks can have, not just on our government institutions, but on our strategic infrastructure, railroads, shipping, businesses, all those kinds of things. So you think our investments would be better spent shifting to defending against cyber warfare as opposed to the possibility of conventional warfare?
Yes. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the Central Intelligence Agency has demonstrated that it is um, taking one step forward and 2 steps back over the course of these last decades. This is in evidence in the events leading up to and following 9/11. That this had different sets of approaches been taken. Much of this could have been avoided, and certainly this idea of a 20th century intelligence agency operating in this aggressive way that the Central Intelligence Agency has operated and continues to operate is not a benefit to us all. So I would go so far as to say that I would effectively dismantle the Central Intelligence Agency in favor of a cyber-focused entity. And there are, of course, corollary agencies that do serve that role today, but the funding of them is small relative to these more traditional agencies. So whatever the form of that, I would certainly, as president, be focusing on, and again, this comes down to what digitalization is and how it provides benefits. Digitalization and automation allow us to do a lot more with less, and this is true in intelligence services as in any other discipline. And so we should focus on building agencies of that kind. I feel quite strongly about that.
Great. Let's close the loop at sort of a half foreign policy, half domestic policy issue. We'll talk about border and immigration, because that certainly has a foreign policy element as well as a domestic policy element. And then we'll bring it back into economic issues and other things. The president, of course, made famous his Build a Wall speech. It was a very important pillar of his campaign in 2016. But of course, the Democrats have resisted at every turn in building a wall. But in the absence of that, we've seen that there really hasn't been the kind of investment in Central America to fighting crime, gangs, violence, which is really kind of causing a lot of the mass migrations that we see up through Mexico into the United States. The same is true from Venezuela. So in sort of a multifaceted kind of question, how would you approach the illegal immigration problem that we see in the United States? Would you look at investing more in countries like Central America? And would you also look at lifting economic sanctions against a country like Venezuela and Cuba?
Yes. Well, there's the world that I would like to live in, and there's the world that we, in fact, do live in. As you've no doubt surmised from my description of the Reform New Deal for America, I am advocating for a quite expansive set of economic policies, and in order to be able to implement those, we have to have a pretty clear definition of who is to get that. So in this respect, I am highly sympathetic to the plight of refugees, economic refugees, climate refugees, and so forth. But I would say that I would not be at such pains to involve these people in this set of programs, because I feel that we have a duty to these 360 million residents in the country. We have to see that what we have failed to do, the creation of a true functioning civil society, and I do believe that a nation without a basic income or guarantees of this kind is one where people are forced into they're forced to live rather more like animals than contributing citizens. And my focus is on the creation of this middle class freedom dividend, the implementation in stages of a public health service that uses advancing technology to better effect. And I feel that we must do these things. And I will not say that building a wall is a good use of resources, but I will say that we are at a juncture in history where we do need to focus on our own affairs and on domestic policy of the best kind, and there is an ordering of importance in these things. We can't always focus on a wedge issue, but we do have to focus on trying to do the right thing for this country, the United States of America. Sure. Sorry, please go on.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask very quickly, Venezuela, do you support continuing economic sanctions? Do you support loosening economic sanctions? Or do you support taking more of a direct military approach to overthrow Maduro and bringing into power a more centrist government, as sort of a placeholder government until new elections can be called?
I do have my own personal feelings on this, but I would also like to say that I have dealings with Central American organizations. I worked on a specific public health initiative based in Bolivia, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, and I don't care to speak to ideas of regime change in the region because I have dealings at this time on this. I've worked quite recently on an initiative to see that the city of Buenos Aires declares aging as a disease as a response to COVID, and tries to use preventative measures to advance the goals that I've mentioned of using a better technology in their very realized public health service. But because I've had some recent dealings with folks, I don't want to speak to this so directly, but I will say, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say not specifically regime change. You don't need to talk about that, but in favor of loosening economic sanctions or maintaining course with economic sanctions in Venezuela?
Yes, I think that as a general rule, economic sanctions are used as a very blunt instrument that you were punishing ordinary people for the mismanagement of others, and so I am on the whole opposed to economic sanctions and in favor of taking more novel approaches to dealing with international relations.
And as far as Cuba is concerned, would you favor ending the embargo if you became president?
Yes, out of a similar set of concerns. I don't think that this is fair to another country's citizens to take bread out of their mouths because of things that their leadership has done. I think that there is always going to be a time and a place for a firm hand in international relations, but I don't think that firm hand should take the form of economic sanctions.
Great. I do want to get back to the economic issues because I know that those are important, but I did want to touch very briefly on energy, transportation, and environmental policies. Try to keep this because we're getting close to our hour-and-a-half mark, so I want to make sure that we get to the economic issues and have time to kind of sum up as well. So very quickly, if you can, very short 30 seconds, what would be your energy policy? What are kind of the key tenets of that policy?
Yes, yes. Well, it's extremely important that we remove these perverse incentives for the use of damaging products. So I would tend to ban crude exports and fossil fuel subsidies, and very much promote not only the kinds of green technology that's discussed in the mainstream, but also bright green futurist technology like carbon capture and others. These are things that we can be doing now to stave off this very real apocalypse. We've lost maybe sight of that, some of us, because of other concerning situations in 2020. But the climate crisis is still a very real concern, and we have to address it, and that has to be addressed at the federal level.
And speaking of climate, and speaking of the environment in particular, there's, as you know, that the environmental movement has shifted really to focus on climate change. A lot of the talk came out about the Green New Deal that Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had proposed. But it seems as if almost that the debate has shifted away from taking proactive common sense measures around the environment that we all kind of support into kind of extremist in climate policies versus pro-business policies. And there doesn't seem to be any kind of way of bringing two sides together to act in a more balanced approach so that we can actually make progress in the environment and climate. So how would you really approach the environment as president? How would you approach trying to bring more people into the movement instead of making it into kind of an us or them, it's all or nothing at all kind of approach, which we've seen politicians adopt more and more over the years. And the end result is that nothing really gets done. It just gets more and more hostile. So what would you do as president to try to bridge that gap, bring people together, and make real strides towards protecting the environment and cleaning the environment?
Well, this entrenched camps concern that you've described is one that is echoed by techno-futurists across the political spectrum, and it is why I would again emphasize removing these influences of these moneyed special interests, removing these vast subsidies. We spend 3 times as much on these kind of on fossil fuel subsidies as we spend on education. And we need to remove these perverse structures, but we do also need to focus on technologically sophisticated and proactive approaches in that middle ground that you've described. And that's why I am a bright green futurist, and why I advocate for undertakings like carbon capture and other approaches of this kind. This is a good middle path. And we are, I think, by focusing on the rhetoric, doing something of a disservice. I think that the rhetoric, the strong rhetoric on the part of environmentalists has advanced this movement. There would not be a conversation wherein every country's ruling party must address green policy without it. And that rhetoric should continue. But in practice, in policy terms, we have to consider those and other approaches as well.
Great. Supreme Court very much in the news, and one of the interesting dynamics in the very landmark case that provides civil rights and worker protection for gays and people who are transgender is the fact that the president's conservative appointee actually sided with the liberal bloc to make this law on the books. So I guess if you became president, would you have any kind of litmus test? Do you have a particular kind of model of justice in mind that you would like to appoint to the Supreme Court? Because the next president certainly could have that opportunity to appoint 1 or 2 justices in their 4-year term.
Yes. Well, I find it a little disconcerting, and I'll say maybe disconcerting is almost too strong of a word. But this social issue of a substantial one, and one that I am in favor of this ruling. But this this the right wing appointees and the two or three who ruled in favor of this recent judgment. I'm imagining if there was a ruling right now on an emergency public health concern, if those people would be quite so broad-minded and liberal in their decision. This doesn't cost anyone any money to make a judgment of this kind, and these right-leaning judges were appointed through a set of stratagems not meant to suppress social liberals, but rather meant to enhance this corporatist control. And so they will happily throw us a bone that doesn't cost them any money in the form of these kinds of judgments. But they would be highly unlikely to make a similar kind of concession that would actually improve the situation of public health or economic policy undertakings of a similar kind that I've described. And that saddens me. And that saddens me because I don't think that we can truly claim to be fiscal conservatives until we achieve this baseline wherein people are living well and contributing. And no less than Milton Friedman supported basic income initiatives for much the same reason. That economy where people are able to live well and are not living like crabs in a barrel is one that is able to grow and flourish. And that is not a world that we have yet achieved. And that is something that we do owe it to ourselves to acknowledge.
Right. So let's shift back as we kind of wrap up. We've got about a little less than 15 minutes. I want to make sure that you have time to sum up on your key takeaways as well for voters. But we do still have a few questions that have come in, so I want to make sure that I get to as many of those as possible. So one question from a Reform Party delegate has to do with cyber currency. So do you favor a cyber currency replacing our current paper-based currency, and how would that ultimately work? And try to keep this to about a minute and a half. I know it's a complicated issue, but I think we might have a chance to come back to it a little bit more in a few minutes. But how would that impact ultimately poor people who maybe depend a little bit more on paper currency than they do electronic? So the question is about cyber currency. Yeah.
That is the biggest concern there would be to make sure that we do not see a skew into territory at the implementation of full digitalization of currency that favors banks tending to penalize working people more easily. That's a mistake, that's a trap that we've had difficulty avoiding in the past. I should say that of coins and cryptocurrencies on the whole, I am strongly in favor. And I would ultimately like to see the fiat currencies and state currencies replaced by more decentralized and human-centered institutions. But that we do all live in nation states. We have to continue to do so, and it's not a simple matter to dismantle a state's currency. This is a real-world question. Any number of countries, including the United States in recent months, have had proposals for a cyber currency. And I think that a lot of those proposals are quite reasonable. But I think that it is important to recognize that there are a lot of potential areas for exploitation of working people there, and other exploitations besides that we would have to be highly vigilant in approaching.
Great. One delegate had written, you talked a little bit about Citizens United earlier, and obviously since Citizens United is a Supreme Court ruling, so it can't be sort of overturned through executive order or legislation, but the person is asking about ways that it could potentially be neutralized. Specifically, she asks, would you support prohibiting nonprofit organizations from quote unquote influencing elections, end quote, in order to maintain their nonprofit status. So I guess you have a choice. You either be a nonprofit or you take on the role of being able to influence elections. So giving organizations a choice. Would you favor something like that? And what are some other steps that you would see to kind of take the sting out of Citizens United or neutralize it, to use her term?
Yes, yes, it is important to point out, and I think that I did kind of expand upon that or step back from that at the time. But it is important to point out this is a high-level judiciary matter. But the president is able to leverage a lot of influence in matters of this kind, indirectly, and just in a way that I'm not inclined to think that this pro-transgender ruling might have passed so easily were it not for these strong sentiments in favor of social reform that are occurring throughout the country in recent weeks. So just as citizens are able to apply pressure, the chief executive is able to apply a lot of pressure in some of these areas as well. Yes, and as to neutralizing the influence of political action committees, this must be done in the spirit of transparency, this it's not so difficult. There's an awful lot of countries that don't have this kind of pervasive influence in their legislative and governing processes, and we need to take a step back and look at how other governments are run and see that we could easily manage such reforms, particularly in these times when so many people are asking for us to consider reforms of this kind.
Sure. Quick question. We're going to spend the last part of this conversation on economic issues, because I know those are really important. I want to make sure that we get those covered. As far as ballot access and your work as far as running, one of the delegates asked, what is your goal as far as ballot access, either getting on the ballot or as a write-in candidate? And so you just talk briefly about that, and then let's dive into to your economic plan.
Yes, yes. Well, in my work with another party, a very young party, I should add, made some significant inroads into ballot access, even though this party was quite new. And the Reform Party has a lot of this infrastructure and history, so I feel that that type of undertaking would handily continue in the coming months. And I do feel that it is important, and I think I was somewhat rightly taken to task in that private discussion this weekend, where I said that we shouldn't focus too much on ballot access. We must focus on ballot access. But if we have ballot access and not a messaging that resonates with people, that ballot access means very little. So we must do all of the things, and in this case, both of these important jobs. And if we are able to do that, I think that we can restore the Reform Party to a great glory. And again, this is a unique opportunity right now. The party that is able to offer people something, meat on the table in terms of these kinds of economic policies, could very well be a ruling party for many decades to come, not just make inroads through the electoral dysfunction and barriers to entry, but actually take a place and make a change for the better in this country. And I feel that the Reform Party can do that even in the coming months. I felt that, to some degree, Rocky De La Fuente soft-sold that possibility a little bit in that discussion. We should focus on joining forces with the people and taking this country by storm. That is by offering them truly reform-minded and humane economic policies, and earning our place among them. And I feel that this Reform New Deal for America is the way to do this.
So let's, in the last few minutes that we have, And I think we've covered, let's just make sure we've covered all of the questions. So I think we've gotten through most of the delegate questions and the chat questions that have come in. And so let's dive into your economic proposals in the last few minutes that we have. So start off, let's talk about what is the first and most important economic proposal that you think is going to really shift this country, get things moving in the right direction. Go ahead.
Yes. Well, as I mentioned, the middle class freedom dividend is a federal land dividend, and it relies upon the leasing of these lands held in great number to institutions, and those would not be limited to domestic institutions. As you know, the other countries, China and others, have a long history of snatching up properties in this country in recent decades, and rather than selling them to them outright, we can allow them to participate in a program like this. In fact, I don't think that there is a realistic funding of this without an international element as well as a domestic element. There's a lot of land to be sold, and we would not want to focus on pre-funding this program. We would want to begin providing this service to Americans at their time of need as we build out this program to a great scale. Please.
Yeah, you talked before about a universal basic income. Is that correct? Yes.
Yes.
So there are countries that have looked at that, and some of the debate that's sort of been put forward. I know Andrew Yang and really made that a very popular part of his campaign in the Democratic Party. But some countries have tried it, and in some cases the results have been mixed. In what they look at is they say, well, people are happier, but not necessarily seeing huge changes in job growth or other kinds of things. Are people not looking at the universal basic income maybe in the right way? Do you think that there maybe needs to be more elements of investment and incentivizing certain kinds of actions? How would you approach the universal basic income as part of your plan so that you could win over, obviously, the economic conservatives that are going to be concerned that you're just creating a welfare benefit versus the progressives who want to make sure that people are getting the freedom to use that money to do the things that they need to do?
Yes, and this is quite, and the conversation has shifted in recent months because it's gone from will we see these benefits in raw job numbers in 6 months, or will we see this benefit in a proliferation of married folks starting partnerships or individuals starting sole proprietorships in 6 years? And we do have to consider that this is a long-term proposition, that growth and that shift in the nature of the economy and allowing people to just live well and more fully participate and not be something akin to wage slaves in a country. I mean, this country, these 40 million people who are now out of work, a very large number of those people were not sitting high on the hog prior to that time. These are people. This is a country that has an artificially low minimum wage, artificially high cost of living in the form of housing costs, and so these people, when we talk about the earlier years and the low unemployment rate, that reflects people working 60, 70, 80 hours a job, many of them for a very, very low wage, 70, 80 hours a week for, in many cases, extremely low wages. And that's not something that you should wish on your worst enemy. And yet that is the most common way of things in the United States in recent decades. And so a basic income is something that allows us to break from that troubling trend and allows those people to become actually self-actualized personally and also in the serious contributors to economic growth. But this conversation has shifted, as the listeners are no doubt aware. Spain has now created a durable basic income. It's in that process. They have legislated for this creation, and many other countries. South Korea, just about 4 days ago, was in the news. A high-level official saying that they are considering this, and you know, I mentioned an initiative that I had worked on with in South America with developers of the smart city down there. They asked me to write a number of proposals for them. One of those proposals does relate to a basic income. That is, I think that these countries that do implement a basic income should create a transnational compact wherein they discourage young people to leave the country in favor of a lower cost of living with their basic income by creating an open borders compact within other countries that have a basic income of a similar scale, a livable basic income. And I think that countries could already begin to sign off preliminarily on that, even if they have not signaled a strong intent to a basic income. This is a world that we are moving into. And I do apologize, I've gotten a little long-winded.
Yeah, I do want to make sure that we just get a chance to 30 seconds, if you can. What do voters need to take away from you and your campaign and why you want to be president? Let's just try to keep it to about 30 seconds, and then we can conclude from there.
Yes, I thank you for that, Michael. Thank you for putting this together, to all of the Reform delegates for taking the time to consider my proposals. The Reform New Deal for America is a reform-minded yet sensible program, and the middle class freedom dividend funded by the federal land dividend, the I Vote USA, and the Medicare for All Plus. These are things that would put us in good standing with reform-minded people in the United States at this critical juncture of history. So I would encourage you delegates to give me the opportunity to represent you as a presidential candidate in the coming months. And we will not only grow this organizationally, but as a movement that is truly reform-minded and on the right side of history.
Thank you so much, Ben. We really appreciate that. I feel like we could probably go on for another hour and a half, but you know, this does sort of open the idea and possibility that we talk again, and regardless of what happens, you know, to keep this forum going, to make more videos, to do more webinars and do more live events, and to really kind of help get your ideas and the ideas of other candidates out there. Just as a reminder to everyone who's tuning in and who's watching, that we are going to have the other candidates. We're going to have tomorrow night, we're going to have Rocky De La Fuente. On Thursday, we're going to have Soraya Fass. And then on Friday, Max Abramson, and then we're going to have our vote. But this is certainly not the last time that we will hear any of these candidates, but we do encourage you to tune in, watch them live, ask them questions, as well as watch the on-demand videos when you get a chance. So Ben, thank you again for your time, and thank you to all who have attended tonight. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. This concludes today's presentation of the 2020 Reform Party National Convention, our presidential debate series. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's do it again soon.